Hi, South Coast Christian life groups and leaders. Welcome to week 6 of the fall trimester. For those of you that came out this past weekend for trunk or treat on Friday or for church on Sunday, we hope that you enjoyed yourself and had a great weekend. If you missed the message, you can always catch up with the vodcast or the podcast. So real quick, just make a mental note. This coming Sunday, we're starting a new series called I Appreciate You, where we'll be looking at living a life of gratitude. It should be an awesome series, and our last 2 weeks of life group meetings will focus on messages from that series. For today's discussion, we'll look at Pastor Tom's message from this Sunday on grace and how we can compare grace in our lives to a game of tennis. Yes, you heard me correctly, tennis. So grab your mental tennis racket and let's jump in. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul writes often on grace, and he wrote in Greek because that was his native language. And it's important for us because if you've ever attempted to learn a different language, you may have noticed that there isn't always a direct word-for-word translation. For instance, some French friends that I have told me one time that they don't have the word shallow. So when they look at a swimming pool, they basically would say the deep end and the not deep end. So when we look at the Greek and the Hebrew translations of which the Bible was written, oftentimes the words as they're translated to English are just meant to convey a feeling or an emotion rather than just a word-for-word exchange. So grace is translated from the original Greek as favor or kindness, while also carrying the meaning of extending or reaching towards. It's an action, it's a feeling, it's a way of living. So how is grace related to tennis? Check out this clip from Sunday.
Grace will give you the advantage over sin. How many have ever played tennis before? Okay. Tennis has one of the strangest scoring systems ever. You know, it's just weird. How do you get to 15 on the first point? But you do. 15 is the first point, the next point is 30, and then you get to the next point is 40. It's weird. Why do we? And then if both players get to 40 at the same time, it's called a deuce, and you're tied, basically. And so, okay, and if you've never watched tennis before, it's really kind of confusing. And then when you're in deuce, the next player who scores, all of a sudden it states that they're in the advantage, so advantage Westerfield. And then if I win the next point, I win the game. And so you kind of go from this deuce to advantage to it's kind of an interesting scenario. I share that illustration because I think of God's grace as the advantage that believers have in their life. We have an advantage over the enemy because we have the power of God's grace.
So grace in our lives gives us the advantage, but more importantly, it's a position. And when you live according to grace, your past sins no longer have power over you. So our first discussion question for today is, are you allowing past sins to hold power over you? What is stopping you from accepting the grace of God and moving forward in your life? Or share a time when you've let go of your past, let go of your sins, and through God's grace experienced the advantage position. Go ahead and pause the video right there. So continuing with our tennis analogy, there's kind of a spot in the middle of the court that's called the dead zone, or as I called it with my friends growing up, no man's land. It's an area where you can't really defend the net, and it's also easy for your opponent to still kind of hit one over your head. It's a bad place to be strategically, but you can also be in no man's land in your life. And Pastor Tom says we need to learn to live according to our position and not our condition. Grace sets us free from our condition and puts us in a position as a child of God. So our next question is, what does it look like to be in no man's land in our lives? Have you ever been there? Are you there now? How do you see God's grace changing your position? Go ahead, pause the video right there. Be back with you shortly. So the final point that Pastor Tom made this weekend is that the advantage of grace is that it gives us knowledge. And if we learned anything in the 90s, it's that knowledge is power. Grace can affect the way that we think and live, and it can help us make the right decisions. Take a look at Titus 2, 11 through 12. It's a letter from Paul to his friend Titus. For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions. There's that word passion again. And to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives. So there's a life hack for you right there. Acceptance of grace plus knowledge equals a pretty darn good life. So our final question today is, how does grace help us to exercise restraint over sin? Take a few minutes to discuss that. Pause the video. I'll be back with you shortly. So that does it for group this week. Maybe grab a buddy and a tennis racket and go hit the ball around for a while. And while you do, think about how God's grace can give you a great position of freedom in your life. We'll see you this Sunday for the start of the new series, I Appreciate You. And on that note, we do appreciate you coming to your group. Have a great week. God bless.